Good day. Today's Friday, 3rd April 2026, and before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. If once you've watched this program, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate this fact. Now, in my opinion, the last 24 hours have seen a very ominous turn in the conflict between Iran and the United States and Israel. I spoke 2 days ago about how in his address to the American people on Wednesday, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, despite the escalating pressures he is under, tumbling poll ratings, a festering and rapidly expanding economic crisis, signs of dissension within his administration, nonetheless offered no new ideas, no new thinking. He discussed his conflict, the US's conflict with Iran. He charted no clear way forward. He charted no way towards a negotiated resolution of the conflict. He charted no clear plan for a military victory. Basically, he offered more of the same, and perhaps the most generous interpretation of his address, a very generous interpretation of his address, is that he told the American people to stay the course, and if they did, somehow, in some way, unknown to me at least, unknown I suspect to most people, perhaps even unknown to him also, if the American people stay the course, somehow things will turn out all right. That was the speech, as far as I could see, that he gave on Wednesday. But over the last 24 hours, we have seen new developments in the war, and I would say they are extremely troubling, indeed deeply concerning ones. Firstly, the US Air Force attacked and destroyed a bridge in Iran, supposedly the biggest bridge in Iran, the longest bridge in Iran. What was interesting about that attack, what was disturbing about it, was that there was no obvious, clear military justification provided for the attack upon that bridge. No doubt military justifications could be found. It could be argued that this bridge, which obviously must play a significant role in Iran's transport infrastructure, that this bridge is important to Iran's military logistics in some way. But if there's been any sustained defense of the destruction of that bridge on those terms, well, I'm going to say I'm not myself aware of it. Instead, what we got shortly after was a Truth Social post from the president, which said this: "Our military, the greatest and most powerful by far anywhere in the world, hasn't even started destroying what's left in Iran. Bridges next, then electric power plants. New regime leaders know that what has to be done and has to be done fast." Well, that, I have to say, to me, looks like a threat that unless the leadership of Iran capitulates, accepts whatever the president's terms are, then in that case, the United States will conduct a program of the complete destruction of Iran, of its infrastructure, civilian, military, logistical, and otherwise. Now, that is, well, not, as far as I could see, any kind of military plan. It is, more than anything else, an expression of frustration. Obviously, during the Second World War, attacks on cities, attacks on infrastructure were carried out by both sides. In many cases, those attacks targeted civilians. Since the Second World War, that practice has been considered increasingly wrong and abhorrent, and in most cases, it has become defined as war crimes. Now, in their operations in Ukraine against Ukrainian infrastructure, industrial, energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, the Russians have been painstakingly careful in every case to justify whatever attacks they make by insisting that they're attacking facilities that are directly relevant to Ukraine's war effort. Well, there is no attempt to do that here in this Truth Social post. It is instead, well, presented as some kind of massive bombing intended to carry out destruction on Iran, to rain death and destruction upon Iran, including its civilian population, in order to force the Iranian leadership to capitulate and to accept the president's terms. I am not, as I have painstakingly pointed out on many occasions, I am not someone with any background in war crimes law. But based on advice I have received in the past, when I sought advice about Russian attacks on Ukrainian facilities, this looks to me like the language that brings us firmly into war crimes territory. It looks to me as if the president is acting out his frustration on the Iranian leadership's refusal to submit to his demands by raining death and destruction upon Iran and upon its people. And, well, if this is the policy, if this is the plan, it is not a military plan in any serious sense. It is, of course, as many will point out, a repetition in many respects of what the Israelis were previously doing in Gaza, though I ought to say that the Israelis at least went through the motions of claiming more justification and rationalization for what they were doing than what we see here. And anyway, putting all that aside, what the president is saying here disturbs me greatly. Now, for the record, I don't think this is a workable strategy at all. Many have pointed out that when a military engages in this kind of operation, dealing out death and destruction in this sort of way, it doesn't cause the targeted country to give up or weaken. Rather, it increases anger, it rallies the population more firmly behind the government, it actually stiffens resistance rather than weaken it. And in the case of Iran, I should say that I had a personal demonstration of this yesterday. A very close friend of my wife's, someone who is Iranian and who lives mostly in Britain, but who is in the West, and who is a harsh critic of the Iranian political system and government. He has consistently been so. He is firmly secular in his political stances. One of the reasons why he chooses to live in the West is precisely because of his very strong objections to the political system in Iran. Anyway, there was an exchange of messages between him and my wife yesterday. She asked him for information about the safety of his family, who are, by the way, in the city of Tabriz in northern Iran. And he responded, and he was furious. He spoke about the fact that his family were indeed in danger, though thankfully none of them had so far received injury. He spoke about the damage that was being done to their city and to infrastructure right across Iran. I should say that this person, by profession, is an engineer, and he spoke about the damage that has been done to Iran's infrastructure with the kind of knowledge that an engineer has. And his anger, and from his account, the anger of his family, is clearly now directed against the United States and Israel. And this man who has chosen to make his life in the West is now trying to find ways to return to Iran, to be with his family. And for the record, knowing quite a lot as I do about him, he is the sort of person who could materially contribute to Iran's war effort if that question were ever to arise. Well, obviously this is one isolated individual, but I have no reason to think that his opinions and his feelings are not widely shared across Iran today. In fact, there have been any number of articles in the Western media that point exactly in that direction. And, well, all I would say is that I suspect that those feelings are widely shared across Iran. We are going to see a further consolidation and hardening of attitudes across Iran. It means that if there is some kind of ground operation carried out by the United States over the next days or weeks, and there's some reports, and I understand bets, being placed on a ground operation being launched against Iran before the end of April. I'm not a betting man, so I'm not going to discuss that further. Well, in the event that happens, then there is a greater likelihood that that operation will face united opposition from the Iranian people, which will inevitably increase the possibilities that that operation will fail, and conceivably fail disastrously. I was reading certain comments made by the Fox News commentator Mark Levin, who has been a fervid supporter of the war against Iran. He was one of the people who lobbied for it consistently before it started. His latest idea is to arm the people of Iran in the expectation that they will turn their weapons against the Iranian government. There is a long response to this proposal by Mark Levin in The Federalist, a magazine which, as I have pointed out previously, is at the heart of the MAGA movement. it could even be said to represent in some ways the intellectual wing of the MAGA movement. Anyway, the Federalist says that arming the population of Iran, assuming such a thing were even possible, based on previous experience, whenever the United States has done something like this in the Middle East, will be disastrous for all sorts of reasons. Well, all I would say is that if Mark Levin believes that arming the people of Iran would mean that they would turn their weapons against the government of Iran, then he is obtaining completely different information about the actual mood of the people of Iran than I am doing and than I am reading in the media increasingly. And I think it is far more likely that the Iranians would turn those weapons against the United States in the event that there were an invasion force, as opposed to against their own government. Obviously, this is opinions, but I think my opinions are far more fact-based here than Mr. Levin's. Anyway, regardless, and I think this is a further point I want to say, even if this bombing campaign, if that's what we're looking at, is successful, if the destruction of power stations, infrastructure, and all of those things does eventually lead to some kind of collapse in Iran, as far as I am concerned, it would be success bought at a terrible moral and legal price. And, well, I am one of those people who believes that success achieved in that way will eventually and inexorably lead to political failure, as I believe, by the way, we can already see in the case of the decline of support for Israel across the West, including in the United States, consequent upon what has been done in Gaza. Anyway, there we are. That seems to be the current plan at the moment. I would also add that if this kind of bombing operation is indeed what we're going to see over the next few days and weeks, then I have every reason to expect that the Iranians will retaliate in kind. They have repeatedly shown that they do have the ability to respond. There's been attacks, as we have seen, on Iranian desalination plants already, though Iran, as I understand it, gets only 2% of its water from desalination plants. There's every likelihood that if there are attacks on Iranian infrastructure, they will respond by conducting their own attacks against infrastructure across the Middle East, in Israel and in the Persian Gulf states. That could extend to attacks on the desalination plants. That would be a humanitarian catastrophe, as I have discussed in many places. The Iranians could also conduct extensive strikes across the energy-producing facilities across the Middle East, across the industrial systems, which are extensive and which do not appear to be particularly well protected. They appear to be less well protected than those in Iran itself. This is a catastrophic course that this True Social post is pointing to. And I do want to believe that there are people in the United States, in the administration, in the president's circle, in the Pentagon, in the Treasury Department, which is also affected by what is going on, in the Commerce Department, and of course in the Department of Justice, who understand all of this and who are going to point out to the president the folly of acting out on the threats that he is outlining here. Now, I would say that there have been other military developments. The Iranians are now saying that they are now actively coordinating with their allies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, that all three of these parties are working together and are working according to joint plans. Well, I think that is highly likely. I don't know for a fact that it is true. I am not a party to the discussions between the Iranians, the Houthis, and Hezbollah, but I would be frankly surprised were it otherwise. Just saying. If that is correct, then of course, if there are attacks like of the kind the president is threatening against Iran, against Iran's infrastructure, well, surely there must be a serious risk that in any Iranian counterstrikes, the Houthis and Hezbollah will join in which case it's highly likely that we will see a stop of any further oil exports from Saudi Arabia and from the other Gulf producers through the Red Sea, with further effects on energy prices that are not difficult to imagine. And the Iranians are also claiming that they have shot down another US fighter jet. They've claimed that this is an F-35. They've released pictures of what they say is the wreckage of this fighter jet. Those who know a lot more about this than I do say that the wreckage does not seem to be of an F-35, but of an F-15E. I am obviously not someone competent to distinguish between the wreckage of two different fighter aircraft, but it does appear, based on this photographic evidence that the Iranians have released, that at least one further US fighter jet over Iran has indeed been shot down. Now, before I finish here, I would of course say that it could be, that these attacks on the bridges, on the power stations, are in some way connected to this military operation, this ground operation that has been talked about, this plan to insert troops deep inside Iran to try to gain control of Iran's uranium stockpile. It still seems to me, even if that is the case, that this operation, this massive operation to attack power stations and railway lines and other civilian facilities still would run the risk of getting drawn into potential war crimes. But I'm not going to take that further. It's worth saying that the United States, it's worth reiterating that the United States, to my knowledge, has not so far sought to justify these operations in that way, but I am going to allow for that possibility. If so, if this is somehow intended to prepare the ground for some kind of ground operation, I would repeat again that the operation still seems to me to come with colossal risks. I would have thought it extremely unwise inserting troops, lightly equipped, light infantry troops, dependent on air support and presumably helicopters, rotorcraft, and other aircraft for resupply and withdrawal. It still seems to me an exceptionally high risk operation. And of course, if the Russians are indeed involved, as I believe, and as I believe the evidence shows, and if the Russians are providing intelligence to the Iranians, as I absolutely believe, despite Russian denials, which I discussed previously, and if the Chinese are also providing intelligence to Iran, which they, by the way, absolutely are, we could say that definitely, because they're publishing photos of American bases, and they started to do that before those bases were attacked. And as Eve Smith on Naked Capitalism pointed out, in a kind of a way, those satellite photos that the Chinese published were the provision of free public intelligence to Iran. Well, if the Iranians are getting intelligence of that kind and are getting military assistance from the Russians, then I would have thought this operation runs the risk of massive disaster on the scale of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in the early 1950s, where the French were encircled and defeated by the Vietnamese, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which I have discussed in earlier programs. Now, it must be said that there are increasing signs of what could be dissension in the United States. Yesterday, the President of the United States dismissed his Attorney General Pam Bondi. Now, he published a Truth Social post which lavished praise on her, but I noticed that over the course of this Truth Social post, the President said that she would be taking a new job, a new post, as he described it, in private industry or private business, not, in other words, in the administration. So it seems as if Pam Bondi is being pushed out of the administration. She's been basically ejected from the US government. Now, I would like to believe that this is because Pam Bondi and the Department of Justice have been trying to give the President advice about the illegality of some of the things he's been proposing in relation to the war in Iran. I have to say that based on everything I know about Pam Bondi and her relationship with the President, I don't think that is the case at all. I think rather the President is deeply frustrated with Pam Bondi because of her advice, her politically damaging advice over the investigations of Jeffrey Epstein and that whole business, and because of Pam Bondi's failure to conduct vigorous prosecutions of some of the people who the President came into conflict with, mostly over the course of his first administration, people like James Comey and ex-CIA Director Brennan and people like that, and other people also who were involved in the various lawfare activities against the President. But anyway, for what it is worth, this decision to sack Pam Bondi coming now does suggest that there are issues, there are problems in the administration, and it could be that the president is simply using the war to sack Pam Bondi at a time when attention is elsewhere. He doesn't want people talking again about the Epstein affair, for example. But anyway, whatever, it does look like a sign of further down. Perhaps more interesting is Pete Hegseth's decision to sack the Chief of Staff of the US Army. And this is one of several decisions that that Pete Hegseth has taken, basically to remove generals from high-ranking positions within the military. Now, the explanation that's been given is that Hegseth and this particular general disagreed about certain promotions. Hegseth wasn't happy with some of the people that it was suggested should be given higher rank within the military, and this erupted into some kind of conflict, and as a result, this senior military officer has been sacked. Well, it is an explanation of a kind, but it is a sacking that is taking place in the middle of what is, by any objective discussion, a war. And I have to say that a sacking of this kind at this level during that war does, it seem to me, probably reflect tensions between the Defense Secretary and some senior military officials over the conduct of the war. There's been reason to think that there has been these tensions for some time already. There were those reports from a week before the war started about the briefing that the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the US intelligence community gave to the president, over the course of which General Kane and Director Radcliffe are supposed to have warned the president that they could not guarantee success in the operations that the president was ordering them to take against Iran. So it may be that what we're seeing is a sign that these conflicts, these tensions continue. It's perhaps worth pointing out that this military official, the Army Chief of Staff, will have been involved in some of the planning and discussions about the deployment of the 82nd Airborne Division. And is it not at least possible that he might have expressed concerns about whatever proposals to use this division are circulating within the US government? I've already discussed how there was recently a meeting at the White House with senior members of Congress, at which the White House apparently set out its plans, or the plans, for a ground operation. And several members of Congress were deeply upset about these plans. Could it be that the general who has just been dismissed shares those concerns as members of Congress do, and that there is dissension about them? Well, all I would say is I would like to believe that this is true. I would like to believe that there is pushback against this bombing campaign. But I have no inside knowledge that this is the case. I merely raise these possibilities. It does seem to me strange, interesting, if you prefer, that a month into a complex war, a decision to dismiss such a senior general has been made, and frankly, I find it difficult to believe that it was simply over a question of promotions of other US military officers. But this is, as I said, my own view, and I don't want to pretend that I know more than I do. To repeat again, what we appear to be seeing is no real effort to look for a diplomatic compromise. It seems instead as if there is a further pattern of escalation. The president knows about his collapsing poll ratings. He knows about the steady upward rise of energy prices. He must have been warned about the fact that prices at the pumps are rising and that this is causing dissatisfaction within his electoral base. He must know about the growing risks to the global economy. He must also know about the increasing doubts about the wisdom of the military operation and about the way it is being carried out. And I have to say, the obvious way out here is to negotiate, to conduct proper diplomacy, to seek the off-ramp, which, as I discussed in my program yesterday, the Chinese and the Russians seem to be working to provide to him. But my sense instead is that what the president is doing is that he's taking out his anger and frustration out on Iran, ultimately on the Iranian people. There is, I have to say this, clear signs of some kind of incredible tantrum being played out here. And, well, also increasingly reckless moves, which, over and above the damage that they're likely to do, give me every reason to think that we're going to launch from one disaster towards another. Well, that's my views. Again, I'm not a military person, as I've said many times. It could be that I'm missing something. It could be that General Kane and his officials have some secret plan, mystery plan that they're working on and which they intend to execute, and which is going to turn the whole situation round over the next few weeks. But that's how it looks to me. That's how the situation looks to me at the moment. Now, returning to this topic, the Russians have been saying further things. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has been back. He's been saying that the situation is, the whole situation is going very bad, that the situation is becoming very bad. And he has also said that because of the deteriorating situation, there are increasing signs of crisis between the United States and its NATO allies. We observe signs of a crisis in both the North Atlantic Alliance and the European Union. But then Lavrov goes on to say that no one should take comfort in Russia from this crisis, because the instinct of the Western powers is to enlarge the crisis, to make it bigger, to try to involve everybody in all parts of the world in it, so that the crisis is no longer one that exists just amongst themselves. Our Western colleagues seem to believe that because they are in crisis, they must impose this crisis on all non-Western associations, echoing the words from the film, "Don't let anyone have you." And he's referring, by the way, to a film, a Russian film, A Cruel Romance, which I'm not going to dwell on. And anyway, he then continues, and Tass's take on it is that he's implying that Western policies aim to exert influence over other regions in times of turmoil. And that we have a further quote, multilateral diplomacy and multilateral construction of a new world is the way forward in response to this. And again, Tass says that this is a critique of Western diplomacy. And another Russian official has gone on to say that another Russian diplomat, senior Russian diplomat, has also spoken out, and he has said that what is going on, the conflict, is a further sign, is a product of the West's use of coercive diplomacy to conduct foreign relations. And it's Sergei Ryabkov, the emphasis on exclusivity, hegemonism, and the use of force is absolute in Washington's current policy. This is one of the reasons why the world is being shaken by one crisis after another, why we're going through such difficult period of challenges. For our part, we uphold the supremacy of international law and the cornerstone principle of indivisible security, and we call on everyone to proceed from the fundamental understanding that one cannot strengthen their security and address related issues at the expense of the security of others. Now, notice again, though, what Ryabkov is saying. The emphasis on exclusivity, hegemonism, and the use of force is absolute in Washington's current policy. So if it is absolute in Washington's current policy, that must mean that it is not, that is not just true about US policy, Washington's policy relative to Iran. It is also absolute in relation to US policy in relation to Russia and in relation to the conflict in Ukraine as well. At least that is how it reads to me. And if one follows from this, well, that reinforces the view that there are at least some people in Moscow who are increasingly saying that let's look at the reality of the United States at the present time. They are completely wrapped up in policies of hegemony and domination and use of force. How then can we seriously hope that we can ever agree with them a reasonable diplomatic resolution of the conflict in Ukraine? Given what Washington is, given how it is focused on hegemony to the exclusion of anything else, we can't seriously believe that when the Americans negotiate with us about Ukraine, they have any real concern or any real feelings about our interests. So, well, that, it seems to me, reinforces my impression that the Russians are steadily moving away from any further expectation that negotiations with the United States are going to lead to any kind of conclusion of the conflict in Ukraine, a conclusion of the conflict in Ukraine that the Russians can work with. And for that reason, I further think that the Russians, who have conspicuously opted out of further trilateral meetings with the Americans and the Ukrainians, have basically given up on that process and are now exclusively focused on conducting the war and winning it on military terms. Well, that's Lavrov, that's Ryabkov. Another, arguably even more senior Russian, has spoken, and he has said something very important and very interesting. And that Russian is Dmitry Medvedev, vice chairman of the Security Council, de facto head of the Military Industrial Commission, former president of Russia, former prime minister of Russia, Putin's number two, and the man who has consistently set himself out as the hardliner in the conflict, and who has consistently outlined the toughest, most hardline position on the Russian side. Anyway, Medvedev has today published this telegram message. And firstly, he addresses the question of whether there really is a crisis between the United States and the European members of NATO, and whether these threats that Trump is making to withdraw from NATO, for the United States to withdraw from NATO, whether these threats actually have any reality. And this is what Medvedev says. I'm going to read the entire message that Medvedev has posted. No, Trump isn't leaving NATO, and neither is America. Obviously, there's no real reason to, and Congress won't allow it anyway. About all of that, by the way, I have no doubt that Medvedev is right. Trump's rhetoric is nothing but posturing. Sure, some symbolic gestures are possible, trimming the size of the American contingent, withholding certain deliveries, but that's not the interesting part. And then this is what Medvedev comes to, and this is the punchline. What's obvious is that serious fault lines exist within the alliance. And of course, that's just what Lavrov has said. And I should say that there was a Security Council meeting, I think either yesterday or the day before, and Lavrov and Medvedev both talking about serious fault lines and divisions in NATO within the Western alliance strongly suggests to me that there was a discussion about this very thing at that Russian Security Council meeting. And that what we're going to see now, what we're going to hear now from Medvedev, are echoes of some of the things that were talked about at this very meeting. Anyway, Medvedev continues, what's obvious is that serious fault lines exist within NATO, fault lines the Iran campaign has only deepened, and Europe's political, and then he talks about leaders, but he uses an extremely rude word, which I'm not going to repeat, especially the Brussels crowd, have started genuinely mulling the creation of a fully fledged military component inside the EU. That is what reshapes the picture. And this is now the punchline. Until now, our position on EU membership for neighbours has been measured and calm, even regarding Banderite Ukraine. Want to join? Go ahead. But that has to change. Notice that Medvedev is not saying that let's consider whether this should change, let's have a discussion about it. He says that has to change. The EU is no longer just an economic union. It can transform, and rather quickly, into a full-blown military alliance, one overtly hostile to Russia and in some ways worse than NATO. It would be a revolting rabble of unhinged European parasites whose entire purpose will be to harvest political capital and, of course, cash from stoking Russophobic hysteria. Well, that is Medvedev's language. He's never shy to use strong words, just to say. But, well, ultimately, I don't fault his underlying analysis, even if I would not express it in quite these terms. But then Medvedev continues, so where am I going with all this? Simple. It's time to drop the tolerant attitude towards our neighbours joining what is now a military economic European Union. This includes, and then he uses a rude word to refer to Ukraine. Our president recently signalled exactly this in politely coded terms, hinting to a certain comrade Pashinyan that membership in the EU and the European Union are the EAEU, the European Eurasian Economic Union, and the European Union are simply incompatible. Now, what Medvedev is referring to is a meeting that Putin recently had with Nikol Pashinyan, in which Pashinyan visited Moscow, had a meeting with Putin, and this was some kind of a fence-mending visit by Pashinyan. Relations between Russia and Armenia have been coming under a great deal of stress recently, and that is an understatement. Anyway, there was this meeting. Armenia continues to be deeply dependent on Russia economically. In fact, as Putin carefully reminded Pashinyan, economic relations, trade relations between Russia and Armenia have expanded tenfold in recent years, and this has been central to Armenia's economic recovery and expansion. But over the course of this meeting, Putin delivered this polite warning. What Medvedev is alluded to. We observe that there is an ongoing discussion in Armenia concerning the development of relations with the European Union. We remain entirely calm about this and understanding that each nation endeavours to maximise the advantages of cooperation with third countries. However, this must be transparent and articulated honestly in advance, as it were, on the shore beforehand. Simultaneous membership in the customs union, that is the Eurasian Economic Union, with the European Union and the EAEU is impossible. It is simply untenable by definition. This is not even a political issue, it is purely economic. Some matters require extensive collaborative efforts that must be undertaken over years. These include differences in the evaluation of specific product groups, their market entry, phytosanitary supervision for agricultural products. Russia and the European Union have entirely different, markedly divergent requirements concerning phytosanitary matters. There are also numerous other issues today. At this present moment, perhaps years will pass and we, the EAEU and the European Union, I hope this will eventually be the case, given that we reside on the same continent, we will be able to resolve them. Yet even before the Ukrainian crisis, when we attempted to reach an agreement with the Europeans to collaborate, nothing came to fruition. They adopt an exceedingly rigid stance on virtually every matter, even on issues that seemed minor to me at the time. And by the way, and since I'm on the subject of Russian relations with Armenia, I ought to say that over the course of this discussion, Putin also gently reminded Pashinyan that Russia has many friends, as he put it, in Armenia, which some might construe as an implied threat as well. Anyway, I'm not here to discuss Russian-Armenian relations. Medvedev, however, is saying that these comments of Putin's were a broader hint that Russia is intending to be less accommodating in future when its neighbours indicate a wish to join the European Union. This could apply to Armenia. Well, this clearly does apply to Armenia. It could apply to Moldova as well, by the way. But of course, what Medvedev is specifically talking about is Ukraine. And I have discussed in many programs how the Russians have until very recently been actually supportive of the idea that Ukraine should eventually join the European Union. Contrary to what many believe, the Russians until now have never opposed Ukraine's bid to join the European Union. In fact, the Russians, in the Istanbul Agreement of April 2022, specifically agreed to a clause in that draft Istanbul Agreement of April 2022, whereby Russia actually said that it would support Ukraine's bid to join the European Union as part of an overall settlement of the current conflict in Ukraine. But I have also been saying for roughly a year that the days of Russian willingness to support this, to support Ukraine's bid to join the European Union, are passing. And here we have Medvedev, arguably the number 2 in the Russian Security Council and in the Russian political system, now openly coming out against it, saying that Russia must oppose Ukraine's membership of the EU, that the EU is no longer just an economic association, but is clearly becoming a military alliance as well, and moreover an anti-Russian military alliance. And Medvedev is hinting that Putin himself is coming round to this view, and he is suggesting that these words of Putin, these warnings that Putin gave to Pashinyan about Armenia's bid for EU membership, point in the direction of Putin also coming round to opposing Ukraine's membership of the EU. Well, I have to say, reading Putin's words to Pashinyan, I think Medvedev is straining the meaning of those words when he is suggesting that these are a hint of a change in Russia's stance towards Ukraine's membership bid of the EU. I mean, what Putin is saying is that membership of the Eurasian Economic Union and membership of the EU are incompatible things, and even moving towards greater economic integration with the EU that falls short of outright membership will eventually create a situation where Armenia's existing membership of the Eurasian Economic Union becomes impossible. So this is an argument made on economic issues. And of course, Ukraine is not a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, just saying. So it seems to me that, as I said, Medvedev is straining the meaning of Putin's words here, or so it seems to me. But, well, it appears that there's been a discussion. There's been a discussion at the level of the Security Council. And I go back to those earlier comments that I'd made over the course of the last few weeks, to Putin's words apparently to Trump over the course of their telephone conversation at the end of December, that the attack on Valdai, on his residence at Valdai, what was clearly an assassination attempt on Putin, would mean that the Russians would harden their diplomatic position, their position in relation to a future settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. And there's been, well, some hints from Russian officials that might be the case. It's been contested up to now, and legitimately so, I would say. But anyway, here we have Medvedev coming out and saying it openly, that the point has now been reached where Russia can no longer support Ukraine's membership of the EU. In fact, no longer support it is not accurate. As of now, Russia must oppose it. Just as Russia opposes Ukraine's membership of NATO, Russia must henceforth also oppose Ukraine's membership of the EU, because the EU is no longer an economic and trading alliance. It is a military alliance, and it must be treated in that way. Well, as I said, there's clearly been a discussion here. The fact that Medvedev has come out and spoken in the way that he has suggests to me that there was a discussion very recently on the Security Council, the Russian Security Council. We see that Lavrov appears to be echoing some of his language. And the fact that Medvedev is coming out so confidently, opposing Ukraine's membership of the EU, suggests to me that there is probably majority support for that position within the Russian Security Council. And, well, Medvedev is hinting that Putin is coming round to that opinion as well. Now, I would just quickly add here, that if the Russians are now going to treat the EU as a hostile military alliance, not just an economic association, then this does have wider bearing. It doesn't just apply to Ukraine. It applies to Moldova. It applies obviously to Armenia and Georgia, both of which still aspire to EU membership. But arguably, based on what Putin is saying, it could affect future developments in Central Asia as well. Various Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, for example, have at various times dabbled with the idea of closer relations with the EU. Azerbaijan, from time to time, does the same. The Russians have, until recently, turned a relative blind eye to this. Maybe they will not do so going forward, just saying. Anyway, here it seems to me we have the first unequivocal signal, not from Putin, but from Medvedev, of a hardening of Russian terms. And I would just say that what Medvedev says may sound extremely hardline and extreme initially, but eventually the pattern of this conflict is that what he says, sooner or later, eventually becomes Russian policy. So, there it is. Now, there's been an awful lot going on in the war. There's been another big Russian missile and drone strike against Ukraine. The Russians have been using large numbers of Iskander-M ballistic missiles. There's been very significant damage done to various Ukrainian facilities, and I gather that over the course of this attack, the Russians also destroyed a moving train and locomotives and those kind of things. Clearly, this is an attack on the energy system and the logistics system in Ukraine. The Russian Defense Ministry, as I have said, will carefully justify it on the grounds that it is a military operation intended to achieve a military objective. Well, that is a topic for further discussion at some further time. There have also been further Russian advances. There's been claims that the Russians are in the business of recapturing the territory in northeastern Zaporozhye region that the Ukrainians captured over the course of their offensive in February and March. Well, it may be that that territory is indeed being recaptured, but I personally think it more likely that the Ukrainians never captured it in the first place. In other words, what we're seeing are Russian troops on this territory because they never left. What we are getting, however, in Zaporozhye region are further advances towards the town of Orekhov. The Russians, now that the thaw is coming to an end, are definitely working on the eastern and western defences of Orekhov. And there are some reasons to think that they're also attacking Orekhov from the south. There is information that the Russians have captured around half of Belitska, north of Rodinska, and that the Ukrainian garrison there is effectively surrounded. The Russians, and this is confirmed by video footage, now seem to have control over the greater part of southwestern Konstantinovka, the industrial and more heavily built up area. And, well, if you believe some of the maps, and I'm not sure that I do, by the way, then there is a large area in southwestern Konstantinovka, which is in effect a cauldron, where Ukrainian troops are in effect surrounded. This would, of course, be very similar to what we saw in Pakrovsk. The Ukrainians are always very slow to withdraw their forces from positions in cities, and it's possible that there are Ukrainian troops surrounded there. But again, to reiterate, it could also be true that the mapping projects are behind actual events, and that the Ukrainians, or at least most of the Ukrainians, have already withdrawn from these positions. And, well, there continue to be reports about Russian domination of the skies over Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and of Russian advances around Liman. And there's now some claims that the Ukrainian garrison in Liman is surrounded and in a cauldron, though no word to that effect so far from the Russian Defense Ministry. And, well, the Russian advances in Sumy continue. There are increasing claims, including an interesting claim by the Russian journalist Marat Khairulin, that what we are now indeed starting to see are the first moves in Russia's spring offensive. I am still not entirely convinced that this is the case, but it could be that we are moving now in this spring offensive beyond shaping operations. Certainly it does look as if the Russians are now advancing right across all of the conflict lines pretty much simultaneously. Khairulin compares this to the swing of the pendulum, that the Russian forces are like a pendulum that swings backwards and forwards across the entire conflict line, exhausting and putting extreme strains on the Ukrainians. But of course, I'm not there. The General Staff in Moscow don't tell me their plans. It may be that less is going on, more is going on. I can't really say. What is indisputable is that the Russians are indeed advancing. And, well, we'll see where all that leads. I will finish this program by saying something else. The American attack on the bridge in Iran has reopened the discussion about why the Russians have not conducted their own attacks on the Dnieper bridges. This remains one of the great enigmas of the war. The Russians undoubtedly do have the ability to destroy the bridges. That might have been in question earlier in the war, but it is no longer in any doubt today. The Russians, about a year ago, 10 months ago, conducted an attack on one of the bridges in Dnipropetrovsk with around 20 Geran drones. And for several days, that stopped all traffic on that bridge. So the Russians do have capabilities against the bridges. One could speculate on why the Russians are not doing this. But clearly there is a decision. I'm not sure what that decision is or why that decision has been made. Perhaps with all of the various attacks on the logistics system, it is because the Russians are waiting until the moment of their big offensive before they destroy the bridges. And maybe that moment is coming very close. Or perhaps it's because they want to use the bridges themselves in order to cross into western Ukraine once the cities of Zaporozhye and Dnipro are captured. Anyway, it is an intriguing question. It is an enigma. It's one that many people are talking about. But clearly, for there to have been no attack on the bridges, someone at some level made a decision not to do it. And it is a decision that clearly commands consensus support in Russia, because no political